just said to Laura, okay, like now we're going to talk about Alconen boxes. It's hard to follow Gwen, I gotta say.
Especially right before lunch. But, you know, there was an old Muppet movie that I really loved where, and Bert and Ernie meet like an adult who's not part of Sesame Street, and they're like, and he's like, oh, my name is Dan, and they're like, duh, Dan, that name starts with D, and he's like, yes, it does, and Bert is like, I'm so sorry, where I come from, this is small talk, and so that's what I always say. For Alconen boxes are my small talk. This is what we do. So, hey, we appreciate you hanging in there with us.
This is the second time this summer Laura and I get to tag team present, which is super fun.
I know.
So we're gonna just go for it on talking about some of the essential number 4 and 5 updates. So I think we can, flip that. Okay.
There we go.
You want one, maybe I'll do the computer and you do that, then we won't mess it up. Okay, this is exciting. All right. So, and like Gwen, I gotta make this bigger, Laura. I'm gonna make your thing a little 55. I can't see. There we go. Okay, so it's a little hard to see, but the part that you can't see highlighted on your screen, I'm going to read it for you. It's an update to essential number 4 that we just want to make sure everyone is aware of. It probably doesn't sound new because it's something we've been seeing for a long time, but now it's right there, written down. So the part that's highlighted says phonological awareness instruction is best provided primarily in connection to letters, okay? So, while phonological awareness is something, it's an understanding, right, about how oral language works, what matters for helping kids learn to read and write is that we make a connection between oral language, and in particular phonemes, right? Those smallest sounds that are represented by letters, and letters. So for those of you who once had a t-shirt that said, phonological awareness, you can do it in the dark, yes, it's true. But that doesn't help you to help kids learn to read and write that much, okay? If you're never gonna connect that with letters and sounds with print. Okay.
So this change is not, again, as Tanya said, this is based on old research. This has been clear in the research for a long time, but something that's come up in our curricular coaching strand is that it hasn't always been reflected in curricular materials, and because phonological awareness as a construct is something that's all oral, sometimes we have given the impression to teachers that that's how it should be taught. But it's clear that that phonological awareness is more effective when letters, and as Tanya explained, learning to read requires working with letters. There's no way around that part of it. So that change, so we've made this change for that reason, to make that more front and center. In general, we're going to talk about a couple of specific activities today, but in general, we agree on a few principles for teaching phonological awareness, and that is that most instructional time should be spent on phonemic awareness rather than rhymes and syllables, because phonemic awareness is how we're going to get to those letter-sound correspondences. Instruction should support matching those phonemes to letters. And this means choosing the target words carefully for your instructional activities. You want to be focusing on letter-sound relationships that children have been taught. They're not going to be able to connect the sounds they're hearing to letters if that's something that that hasn't been part of their instruction yet. You want to use familiar words. I actually meant to mention this research study the other day when I was talking about culturally responsive PA and phonics instruction, but I got to discuss it for a research paper at last year's Literacy Research Association conference. So it's not available yet, it's not out in the world yet, but what they found, these researchers did a phonological awareness assessment with multilingual students, and they found that when they used words that were in students, it was English phonological awareness and phonemic awareness assessment. When they used words that were in those students' English vocabulary, they did better than words that had the same phonological structure, the same letter-sound relationships, but weren't words that they knew in English. So words that are familiar are easier for them to hold in their working memory and segment and blend and do all that work with. So using familiar words can help kids do this work. But also, we want to avoid focusing on silent letters unless the purpose of an activity is really to support spelling knowledge, right? Silent letters are not salient in our phonological and phonemic awareness activities. And so putting them in there kind of just tricks kids, right? It makes it more complicated for teachers and kids. So those are all things we want to think about when we're choosing our words. We also want to focus on the same letter-sound relationships throughout instruction on a given day, right? Like the way I used to do this when I was a teacher was do a phonological awareness warm-up for a phonics lesson. So we would listen for a particular sound in words, we would generate words that had that sound, and then we would go into the words and think about how to spell that sound. And so doing 15 minutes of phonological awareness instruction over here, blending and segmenting words with short vowels, and then moving into a long vowel phonics lesson, unless you're going to compare and contrast those, that might not be the most effective way to set up the instruction. And then also using letters during tasks. So not just doing things all orally, not just having kids repeat back to you, but actually showing letters, using magnetic letters, writing letters on the whiteboard. So we're going to walk through a couple of examples of that today. But also instruction should be brisk and give kids an opportunity to work through many examples. Sometimes I will watch a video of a phonics lesson that's 30 or 45 minutes long, and then already I'm a little concerned about the length of the video. Like when I download it, I'm like, ooh, that's going to be too long. But in that, usually the reason is that it's just moving too slow. So the teacher is spending a really long time working through one example, but in fact, we want kids to be able to generalize, right? We want them to work through lots and lots of examples, and we want the kids to be doing that work, not just the teacher modeling. So a little teacher modeling, but giving kids opportunity to work with the words as well. So we're going to transition into talking about an example that is highlighted in the standards, which is Alconin boxes. This is one phonological awareness and really a phonemic awareness activity that's highlighted in the new essentials, and that has that additional research that has come out since the essentials were originally written that just supports this recommendation. So for those of you who are not familiar, Alconin boxes are boxes where basically a support for helping kids segment words and identify all the sounds of the words. And so you can do this by all orally, by having kids listen for the sounds and words and push a counter for each sound they hear, like k, ah, t. But then you can use the same activity by having them place letters in those boxes to make those letter sound connections, and you can also use it as a spelling support. So, I'm sorry, I signed myself too big.
I'm just like stand here and admire.
What did you take? I accidentally signed myself on the slides. Okay. So anyway, there was one of the new pieces of research that came out. There was a new review of Alconin boxes, of studies that have looked at Alconin boxes as a way of supporting letter-sound relationships and reading development. Tanya made a really good point the other day that this is just one activity. It is a research-based activity, but you could obviously teach kids to read without ever using Alconin boxes. Like it's just one way, it's just one example. But this research review did find that teaching with Alconin boxes can improve phonemic awareness, letter-sound correspondences, or spelling, depending on how they're being used. They can be used equally effectively in whole group, small group, or one-on-one settings. And they seem to work, as far as the research can show us this, there were only 19 studies, pretty equally well for students from different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds, and with students in general or special education, and that they're cost effective, which just means they're cheap, right? You don't need a lot of materials, you don't need a lot of teacher training. And the key components for effective use of Alconin boxes are modeling, guided and independent practice with feedback, targeting appropriate words for instruction, so words that actually are aligned with where they are in their learning journeys, and progress monitoring, making sure that you are keeping track of how well they're doing. So we wanted to, with this in mind and this new research, we wanted to go back into our Essentials videos to show you that you actually already have some really great examples of this in the Essentials videos that are posted online to show teachers how this works. So this first clip, if it works, should be a classic Elkonin box focused on phonemic awareness.
How many sounds do I have in that word?
3.
3 sounds in that word. I'm going to ask you to try the same thing. Remember, the star goes on the left. Okay, ready? Let's do our sounds. Drag it to the first sound box. Good. Eh. The last sound we hear is How many sounds do you have, Zion? How many counters are there? Count them.
1, 2, 3.
So there are how many sounds in the word fin?
3.
3 sounds in the word fin. Very good. When they know that there are 3 sounds, then they can concentrate and isolate those specific segmented sounds. When they can see it on the
Okay, we're going to stop and we're going to move on to our next slide.
So that's an example of, here, actually, this is your slide.
Okay, cool. So that is an example of what maybe some of you have typically seen for Elkonin boxes, right? So we're using the counter to make a physical representation of the sounds inside the word in oral language. Typically, with our youngest kids, we want to have an actual picture or image of the word that we're going to be segmenting, so kids can connect that to a word in their vocabulary or something that they recognize, also to prevent confusion, because, especially with consonant, vowel, consonant words, like cap and cup don't sound that different always. So if you show them a picture of what the thing is that they're trying to sound out, that helps a lot. We want to move from fewer to more phonemes. So we often start with words like me, e, and then we move to more and more complex words, right? So me would have 2 phonemes, cap with 3, frog with 4, etc. We want to move from easier to harder features to segment. So, for example, those consonant, vowel, consonant words, that's going to be easier for kids to segment than a blend, which is harder. And then what do you do when you have a vowel digraph? That gets a little more confusing, right? So we're gonna move to more and more challenging features. And we can also figure out by assessing kids where they are in their knowledge of phonemes or their ability to orally segment and blend, and use that to inform our instruction.
All right, now we're going to show later in the same video. So if you're using this video with teachers, you could show them an example of doing Elkonin boxes with just the counters, focusing just on the words, and then later in the same video, moving to incorporating letters. Because this is the part that I think teachers, they hear about it and they know they should do it, but they're not really sure what this looks like. So there's actually a really good example here if we can get the video to.
So we want to watch the same video starting at minute 4:35.
We are going to now try and connect the letters that belong with those sounds. So we know we have 3 sounds, but now we need to figure out what letters go in that place. So I have some letters here for you friends to pick. We are looking for the letters that belong in the word sit. I don't want you to take the same things you see your friends taking. I want you to know that those sounds represent there's a letter that represents that sound. So I want you to try and figure out which letter belongs to that sound and build your word. So how many letters are you going to need?
3.
3. Okay. Go ahead and get the 3 you think you need. What letter does this make? What sound does this letter make? And let's do the sounds we hear and put those letters in. Ready? The first sound is S. Everyone, what's the first sound?
S.
What's the sound? S. So put that letter that you think sounds like S in that first spot. Okay, next sound. What is the next sound? We said S. Eh. What letter do you think is eh? What sound? What sound is that? Put it down. Now, Lena, I heard you say a sound. What sound did you say? Eh. And when we say eh, does that sound? Let's do that. Let's stretch that word out. Say it the way you would. Ready?
Okay, great. Yeah.
Flip to the next slide.
Oops. Yeah, so this yours or mine? I can't remember. Oh, yeah, that's yours.
So overall, the evidence suggests that we want to start to map letters with sounds, if not before, then at least by pre-K, right? So beginning in pre-K, we can start to have kids use both the counters and the letters, particularly if we're using letter-sound relationships that kids know. And assessing letter-sound relationships is going to help us to figure out which letter-sound relationships kids know so they can start to represent those sounds in words.
Yeah, and one of the things that, one of the things that you see her doing in the video is really constraining the task, right? Working all with 3 phoneme words and 3 boxes, and giving kids the letters they're going to need before they get started. But you can increase, that's a great way to get started, right? When they're first introducing letters into this task. But you can increase that challenge over time, including using, of course, more complex things like digraphs and vowel teams, if you want to move into that. But also you can teach kids to identify the number of sounds and then draw their own boxes, right? So like you might have 2 sounds, you might have 3 sounds, you might have 4 sounds. You have to think about that and then write out those boxes. You can also teach them to put 2 letters that represent the same sound in one box, for example, sh, or vowel teams. And you can also teach kids to write the letters. A lot of kids need a lot of help with handwriting. That adds an additional level of challenge to write in the boxes, and then practice writing the whole word underneath. And then when you get into these trickier words with 2 letters that represent one sound, you can help them like remember that you're using 2 letters to represent one sound by like providing a little dotted line or something in between them. You can also give them, if you're still working with magnetic letters, you can give them a bunch of magnetic letters, like 8, and they have to find the one that they're using. So it's easier, you can make this task easier or harder. There is evidence that you can use these to support spelling as well. Yeah. Sorry, I'm transitioning.
No, go ahead. You can talk about spelling.
Okay, yeah. Well, and so basically, but the core thing to remember is that this is really a useful task for invented or estimated spelling, right? If we're having kids work in invented spelling, we want them to slow down and think about how many sounds they hear in the word and then try to represent each sound in their spelling. That doesn't mean it's always going to be accurate, right? If it's a spelling lesson and you're teaching them how to spell a vowel team, then yes, they should be trying to use that vowel team. But sometimes if you're using this as part of interactive writing or scaffolded writing, they might use this just for their own, to support their own sounding out of the words, and that's okay too. A question I get from teachers a lot is what to do about silent letters when they're using them for the spelling purpose, and basically they can just go in the recommendation that I see is that they can just go in the box next to the letter that is making the sound. So the K can go with the N in that box. The silent E on the N can go with the final consonant. That kind of thing. So the most important thing, though, is that we don't overthink this. It's not that there's like a perfect Elkonin box way of doing things that will solve all of our kids' reading problems, right? They just need to know what to do. And so as long as you are telling them consistently and you're not telling them a different thing from the Tier 2 teacher, it's fine to do this in different ways. The easiest thing and the thing I see recommended most often is just write it next to the letter that is making that sound. But this brings us to
implementation challenges, right? So sometimes, and I think Laura probably hears this more than me because she's hanging around talking about Elkonin boxes more than me, but sometimes what we hear is, well, there are all these words that don't fit perfectly into Elkonin boxes, so I can't do Elkonin boxes. And what we would say to that is flexibility is key. but also what's the instructional purpose of the lesson. So if the instructional purpose of the lesson with the word 8 is to be able to hear that there are 2 phonemes in the word 8, A-T, right? I think there are 2 phonemes in there,
Yeah, I think
right?
so too.
Okay. Different dialects, you might hear more or fewer phonemes. Like I was joking with someone the other day that my kids grew up in Michigan, and so they call my husband Daddy, and I count D, E, A, Y, D, E in there. So, sorry, friends, I grew up in the Northeast, so I say Daddy. But anyway, so that's the other thing. So we have to be flexible with this, right? If your goal is phonemic awareness and you want them to hear A, T, you only need 2 boxes, right? Which other one? I don't know which one you want to talk about. Or we're doing when, right? The W and H are together. They're making one sound. So we need to figure out that we only need 3 boxes for the word when. There are some situations where you could slice it different ways, right? You could say that world is w, r, l, d. If we want to hear the phonemes, that's how we'd have to do it. But if I'm doing a spelling lesson where I want to teach about R-controlled vowels and that they go together, I might want to have 4 boxes and put those O-R together. And different curriculums will do it different ways depending on the focus of what you're up to. So the instructional goal really matters. Am I working on being able to segment those phonemes and just notice them in oral language? Am I mapping them to letters for the purpose of teaching alphabetic principle, that there should be a letter to represent each sound, but doesn't need to be perfect? Or am I teaching spelling, where I'm focusing on R-controlled vowels, and now I really want kids to pay attention to the fact that those 2 letters together are kind of making a different kind of sound, okay? So flexibility is key with all letter sound knowledge, and we're learning more and more about that. There's some fancy terms for it, but I just call it teaching kids to be flexible, right? Words can sometimes look the same and have different sounds. We want kids to be able to try different things and generally understand some of the ways our language works.
And so this, one thing to think about is given your instructional purpose, sometimes Alconin boxes are great, and sometimes other activities are actually more useful for helping kids work through that particular spelling or, orthographic feature. So another activity that we both really love and used a lot as teachers were word ladders, where you start with one word and you substitute out one sound and have to figure out what letter or letters will help you make that substitution, right? And so you can do these with magnetic letters, you can do them on whiteboards, you can do them on a worksheet where you're starting at the bottom rung and going up to the top rung of an actual ladder. But basically this helps kids pay attention to small, what we call, salient differences between words, right? How words look different depending on small spelling changes and representing them in their spelling, in their writing, and listening to those sounds. So you can do things with, I really like to use word ladders for things like blends, right? Comparing and contrasting minimal pairs is what my advisor used to call these, like the difference between lap and slap, right? And having them hear that difference and then think about the letter they need to make that different word happen, between slap and slat, between slat and slant. Those are all tricky phonemic awareness activities that they can do supported with letters in a word ladder situation. I also find word ladders to be really useful for comparing and contrasting words with silent E, right? Just cramming the silent E into the final Alconin box doesn't do that much for you. But comparing pain and pan, like what is this word if I add an E, what is this word if I take the E away, that can be more helpful for really thinking through what the silent E is doing there. And then you can squeeze D, G, E all into one Alconin box if you want, but you can also just cycle through a bunch of words that use D, G, E to make that sound and have them practice reading and writing a bunch of words. So it really depends on your instructional activity. I want to say that we're going to show an example video of this as well, which is already, again, available in the instruction in letter sound relationships video.
Because even though we didn't have the words updated in Essential 4, even way back when we started, we always wanted kids to be thinking about the sounds and then representing them with letters. Okay.
hopefully this one.
Let's see if we can make it another word. I want to try and make the word set. Can you show me what you would use to make the word set? Set. Can you show
We're
me
always
set?
going to need to use our T.
T is an important letter today. Do you have set, Taylor?
Set.
Good job, Herman.
Think this.
Set.
Oh, yeah.
Sound that out for me, Nathan.
Set.
Nice. How would I make set say sat?
Set made sat. Get it.
We're gonna try the word step. So let me listen how I sound it out. Are you ready?
Oh. I got it.
Making words is helpful as readers and writers because you need to focus on hearing the sound.
Great. So you can see there how it's still a phonemic awareness activity, right? They're working really hard to hear those sounds, and then they're moving the letters around. And these activities where you're substituting letters to make new words, you could also call it, it's also there's a whole protocol around making words, so making words lessons do this as well. I've also heard it called chaining before. There's a whole segment on that Annie does on the Michigan Learning Channel called Mystery Word, that is a word ladder activity. So it sometimes goes by different names, but this is a valuable activity that you can include. Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, so just a few, why are we sharing this with you? Well, we still see in classrooms a lot of things that don't look like what we're talking about here, where we are making sure that there are letters associated with the sounds, right? We see oral language only, phonological awareness and phonemic awareness going on for a really long time, up into the grades, beyond where we really want to have made sure that kids are working with letters and sounds. So we are not saying not to do phonological awareness, but it should be done as part of letter sound lessons. The other thing is that after first grade, right, it's really not supported either in our standards or by the research to be doing a lot of whole group phonological awareness instruction, meaning with no letters, okay? And we are still seeing this a lot in classrooms. So something to work on with teachers who have a curriculum that has them do a lot of whole group phonological awareness activities beyond first grade is how can we add in letters to that. So they don't just have to do the work orally, they could do it with, bring in the letters and sounds. Do you want to switch off on these?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to highlight that when we're talking about activities that segment sounds and words, the essentials specifically say which supports orthographic mapping and spelling unfamiliar words. Like that's the goal, right? Eyes on the prize for all of these activities. And when we're talking about activities that involve blending sounds, it says which supports decoding. So the goal of all of these activities is to move towards those reading and writing activities. And
yeah, so like one thing
Yeah.
that, you all know me, I like to joke around, but like if we're hanging out in a second grade classroom rhyming, that's super fun, but it's not, if we're just orally rhyming and we're never going to put letters and sounds to it, we're not supporting reading and writing by doing that rhyming, right? So ultimately, what we want kids to figure out is that the words in oral language are broken into phonemes, and those are represented by letters. That's what's going to help them read and write. So if that's the goal, we got to get to that goal. And we can't keep doing things that don't get us toward that goal. And it takes a lot of instructional time.
yeah, I had a good conversation with somebody in our curricular coaching group who was like, well, my teachers really want to keep doing this 10, 15 minutes of whole group phonological awareness activities every day because they, only oral only activities every day because then they just know that they got it, right? And I was like, well, they do, but the way I would think about it is it's like, do you want your kids to be getting a vitamin and say like they got it? Or do you want them to eat all the vegetables? I mean, not all kids are gonna eat all the vegetables, so there's some of that. But like, would you rather, like the way that we want to provide this instruction is in a way that's going to help them do the things we want them to do. And the way they're gonna be able to best use it is if it's paired really tightly with that letter and sound instruction. So, and then I just wanted to highlight again, we're looking for opportunities to say and read and write and spell words all the time and connecting all those things up. So I think, did you have anything else, Deb?
Just the flexibility one. So the like, sometimes because English, doesn't perfectly map one letter to one sound, that feels very stressful for teachers to know what to do. But ultimately, the more we learn about teaching kids about letter-sound relationships, the more it actually is that flexibility that helps you, right? When you get to a word in text and you're trying to decode it, and the first sound you try doesn't work and it doesn't match to a word that's in your oral vocabulary, you got to try a different sound, especially with vowels, right? They make a lot of sounds. So if we can't just continue to say to kids like A makes A. Eventually, we've got to say like A actually makes a whole lot of different sounds. And you got to try different ones if you want to figure out what that word is. So moving to that flexibility is very important for kids decoding in the long term.
All right, so we're happy to answer questions and stay in conversation about supporting teachers and doing this work, but it's lunch, and we don't know how to tell people to eat lunch.
I think there's actually something going on before lunch.
Oh, there's something going on before lunch?
Sorry.
It's not lunch.
It's not lunch yet.
Sorry, I thought it was lunch.
Any questions while we're transitioning?
One question. Okay, I was just wondering if there's research that supports also introducing like a kinesthetic movement with each of the sounds, as well as the letter.
I'm going to let Laura be specific about that, but I'm going to say there is evidence that multisensory learning is broadly a good thing for kids, right? So the whole reason we're using those tokens, for example, with the Alconin boxes, or you might see kids like tapping words, or any of that is to help with that multi-sensory learning. I think we also definitely have evidence for letter sound knowledge that having kids form the shape of the letter helps them to connect the letter to the sound, to the shape. So all of that is gonna help kids hold on to that more efficiently. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's also evidence that helping kids recognize the articulatory gesture that goes along with the sound is useful. So sometimes like using mirrors, although sometimes you don't have 20 mirrors in your classroom, that's fine. That's fine too, but having kids watch your mouth and that kind of thing can be helpful. And also picture mnemonics for letter sounds that integrate into the shape of the letter are also helpful for remembering those like key words. So for example, if you're using A as apple as your keyword for an apple, to like draw a little apple in the middle of your lowercase a. So there is some evidence for all of those different types of support and reinforcement. There isn't evidence for like going super, super far and saying this one program that is multisensory does it in the only way. There's not a lot of evidence for things like having to write in shaving cream or sand or that kind of thing. So it's possible to take this idea too far, but in general, yes, there's evidence for supporting kids in moving and representing these sounds and letter shapes together in different ways. Okay, thank you for that question.